She found him bleeding and confused outside the subway, speaking a language that sounded like dying wind. What no one realized, the Vampire King's memory had been magically severed, and Sarah was now the only person who could anchor him to this world or watch him fade into nothing. Sarah Chen pressed her back against the brick wall of the 14th Street subway entrance, her dissertation notes scattered across wet concrete like broken promises. The fluorescent lights above buzzed their mechanical lullaby, casting everything in that particular shade of urban loneliness that made 2 a.m. feel like the end of the world. She had been walking home from the Columbia Library when she heard it, a sound that made her ribs ache from the inside out, words that tasted of copper and starlight, spoken in a voice that seemed to echo from somewhere much deeper than a human throat. The man lay crumpled against the subway grate, blood seeping through what had once been an expensive white shirt. Dark hair fell across his face in waves that caught the streetlight like black water. When he lifted his head, Sarah saw eyes the color of winter storms, and something in her chest shifted like tectonic plates, finding new alignment. He spoke again, those impossible syllables that her trained ear recognized as having the structural patterns of ancient Aramaic, but with phonemes that predated any known Indo-European root system. She knelt beside him, her practical mind cataloging the details even as her instincts screamed warnings. No visible head trauma, but he was clearly disoriented. Blood loss could explain the confusion. The way he kept reaching for things that weren't there, the manner in which his gaze seemed to focus on spaces between the visible world. When he grabbed her wrist, his fingers were ice cold, but his touch sent heat racing up her arm like struck lightning. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you, he whispered what sounded like a name, Kieran, though whether it was his own or someone else's remained unclear. The rational part of Sarah's mind, the part that had earned her a full scholarship to pursue dead languages, knew she should call 911 and walk away. But the scholar in her, the part that had spent years chasing linguistic ghosts through crumbling manuscripts, recognized something unprecedented in his speech patterns. This wasn't just another homeless man having a psychotic break. This was a living speaker of something that shouldn't exist. She helped him to his feet, surprised by how easily he moved despite the blood loss, and guided him through the maze of late-night Manhattan toward her studio apartment above Golden Dragon Restaurant. His weight against her shoulder felt both substantial and somehow insubstantial, as if he existed in multiple dimensions simultaneously. During the 6-block walk, he spoke intermittently in that otherworldly tongue, and Sarah found herself responding with fragments of Aramaic and Proto-Semitic, watching his expression brighten momentarily before clouding over again. Her apartment was a testament to academic poverty and linguistic obsession. Books in 17 languages created unstable towers from floor to ceiling, and her desk groaned under the weight of translation dictionaries and photocopied manuscript pages. She settled Kieran on her futon and went to fetch her first aid kit, but when she returned, the wounds had already begun to close. The gashes across his forearms that had been deep enough to require stitches were now pale pink lines against olive skin. Sarah stared, her logical mind scrambling for explanations. Shallow cuts could heal quickly. Poor lighting could make wounds appear worse than they were. But she had seen bone beneath torn flesh, and now there was nothing but smooth skin marked by the faintest silver scars. Kieran's eyes opened, and in the lamplight they reflected like mirrors, pupils dilating and contracting independent of the light source. He spoke again, a question this time, and Sarah caught the linguistic structure. Subject-object-verb formation with agglutinative morphology. Definitely Semitic base, but with impossible grammatical features that suggested a root language older than Sumerian. She responded carefully in biblical Aramaic, asking his name, where he was from, if he was injured. His face crumpled with concentration, and when he answered, the words came in fragments. Kieran, yes, That was his name. But when she asked about his home, his family, his work, he pressed the palms of his hands against his temples and spoke in rapid bursts that sounded like wind through a graveyard. Fire, betrayal, a woman's voice weaving syllables that felt like chains. Sarah spent the night taking notes, documenting every phoneme, every grammatical structure, every impossible linguistic feature. She had stumbled onto something that could revolutionize the field of historical linguistics. If she could prove this language was genuine, if she could trace its roots, she might be looking at evidence of a previously unknown civilization. Or she might be documenting the delusions of a very convincing mentally ill man who had somehow managed to construct an internally consistent fictional language complete with etymological depth. Dawn crept through her single window like a reluctant witness, painting everything in shades of gray and possibility. Kieran had fallen asleep on her futon, and in the pale light he looked like something carved from marble by someone who had never quite understood what it meant to be human. Too perfect, too still. Even his breathing seemed more like performance than necessity. Sarah made coffee and tried to process what she had witnessed. The healing wounds, the light-reflecting eyes, the language that predated recorded history, the way electronic devices had flickered and died whenever he came too close. Her laptop had crashed the moment his fingertips brushed the keyboard. Her phone screen had developed a spiderweb of cracks when he tried to touch it, and her digital alarm clock had reset itself to 00 and stayed there, as if time itself had become confused in his presence. She was a scholar, trained in the careful analysis of evidence, but evidence was leading her toward conclusions that had no place in her rational worldview. When Kieran woke, he moved with fluid grace that spoke of predator instincts and perfect physical conditioning. He examined his arms where the wounds had been, touching the faint scars with something that might have been surprise or might have been relief. Sarah offered him coffee, which he declined, and toast, which he stared at as if it were an artifact from an alien civilization. She tried English first, then Spanish, then Mandarin, working through the languages she knew fluently before returning to Aramaic. Only the ancient tongues seemed to reach him, though even then his responses came fragmented and confused. She began to suspect that whatever had happened to him had damaged more than just his memory. It was as if someone had taken a complete linguistic system and shattered it, leaving him with scattered pieces that he was struggling to reassemble. The breakthrough came when she offered to help him recover his memories through language therapy. She had read about cases where trauma victims could access lost memories through linguistic triggers, where the act of speaking in their native tongue could unlock neural pathways that had been blocked by psychological damage. Kieran listened to her explanation with an intensity that made her nervous, his strange eyes never leaving her face. When she finished, he reached out and touched her hand, speaking a single phrase that made the air between them shimmer like heat waves. Sarah felt something shift inside her chest, a sensation like puzzle pieces clicking into place in regions of herself she hadn't known existed. The words meant something like, "I accept your protection," or perhaps "I claim your guardianship," though the exact translation eluded her. What she didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that in offering to help a vampire king recover his stolen memories, she had just invoked one of the oldest laws governing his kind. Willing assistance freely offered to a vampire in genuine need created a bond that transcended simple gratitude. She had made herself his anchor to the human world, and according to laws older than recorded history, that made her both infinitely precious and infinitely vulnerable. Kieran felt the binding settle into place like chains made of starlight, and for the first time since waking in confusion and pain, he remembered something clearly. This woman, this brilliant, stubborn human who had brought a bleeding stranger into her home and offered to heal his broken mind, was now bound to him by ties that death itself would struggle to sever. And somewhere in the city, others of his kind would already be stirring, drawn by the scent of new bonds and old power awakening. The game that had cost him his memories and his throne was far from over, and now Sarah Chen was a player whether she understood the rules or not. Sarah noticed them on the third day, men in suits that cost more than her semester tuition, standing motionless across the street from Golden Dragon Restaurant with the patience of marble statues. They never seemed to blink, never shifted their weight, never checked phones or watches like normal people waiting for something. Their stillness had a quality that made her skin crawl, as if they were predators who had evolved beyond the need for restless movement. When she pointed them out to Kieran during one of their morning language sessions, his entire body went rigid, his hands clenched into fists, and those storm-gray eyes flashed silver for just an instant before he pressed his palms against his temples and spoke a single word in his ancient tongue that translated roughly to hunters. He couldn't remember why they were dangerous, but every instinct in his body screamed warnings. The men had been watching for 2 days now, taking shifts with mechanical precision, always maintaining visual contact with her building. Sarah tried to convince herself they were federal agents investigating some unrelated crime, or private security for one of the expensive condos going up in the neighborhood, but their absolute motionlessness felt wrong in a way that made her academic mind rebel against rational explanations. During their afternoon session, Sarah was working through a particularly complex grammatical structure when she made the mistake that changed everything. Kieran had been struggling to remember a specific word, something about protection or guardianship, and Sarah had been trying different linguistic approaches to unlock the memory. She spoke a phrase that felt natural in his language, words that seemed to flow from some deeper understanding she hadn't known she possessed. The moment the syllables left her lips, the air between them ignited. Not with visible flame, but with something that made her bones sing and her vision blur at the edges. Kieran's eyes went wide, then blazed with silver light so bright it hurt to look at directly. The words she had spoken meant something like, "I claim protection over you," or perhaps "I declare myself your shield," though the exact translation seemed to shift depending on how she examined it. Kieran rose from his chair with fluid grace, and suddenly Sarah understood that whatever healing she had witnessed during his recovery was nothing compared to the power that was awakening in him now. His voice, when he spoke, carried harmonics that seemed to resonate in her chest cavity. "The binding is complete," he said in perfect English, though his accent carried traces of something much older than any modern dialect. "You are my anchor now, and they will not suffer you to live." The watchers across the street had gone from marble stillness to predatory motion the moment Sarah spoke her claim. They moved like smoke given form, crossing the busy street without regard for traffic, flowing between cars with impossible grace. Kieran moved to the window and stared down at them, his expression shifting from confusion to grim recognition to something that might have been rage. He remembered them now, these perfect hunters in their expensive suits, council enforcers, executioners who serve the vampire hierarchy with absolute loyalty and zero mercy. They had come because the binding between him and Sarah was now complete, and vampire law was very specific about humans who learned too much about their world. Sarah pressed herself against the wall as understanding crashed over her like ice water. The man she had helped, the stranger whose impossible language had captivated her scholarly mind, was not human. The healing wounds, the electronic interference, the predatory stillness, the eyes that reflected light like mirrors. Vampire. The word sat in her mind like a stone dropped into still water, sending ripples through everything she thought she understood about the world. Kieran turned from the window, and his movement held a lethal grace that spoke of centuries of practiced violence. "I am sorry," he said, and his voice carried genuine regret beneath layers of something much darker. "You offered help to a stranger, and in return I have made you a target. The binding cannot be undone easily, and until it is, you are caught in a war you do not understand between powers you cannot imagine." The enforcers had reached the building. Sarah could hear them moving through the restaurant below with supernatural silence, like shadows learning to walk. Kieran moved to her desk and began examining her linguistic notes with rapid precision, his eyes scanning the pages faster than humanly possible. "Here," he said, pointing to a passage where she had been working on verb conjugations. "You have been translating the old laws without knowing it. These words, they are not just language. They are binding contracts written in blood and starlight. When you spoke the protection claim, you invoked laws older than your civilization." The door to her apartment exploded inward without warning. 3 figures flowed into the room like liquid night, moving with coordinated precision that spoke of centuries of practice. They wore the faces of beautiful men, but their eyes held the flat emptiness of sharks, and when they smiled, Sarah saw fangs that gleamed like surgical steel. The one in the lead spoke in Kieran's ancient tongue, words that Sarah's trained ear translated as something about unauthorized binding and necessary termination. Kieran responded in the same language, and his voice carried authority that made the air itself seem to bend around him. Sarah caught fragments of the exchange: claims of kingship, demands for recognition, threats veiled in formal courtesy. The lead enforcer laughed, a sound like breaking glass, and replied that dead kings had no authority to make demands. That was when Sarah saw what Kieran truly was. He moved like lightning given form, crossing the room in a blur of motion that her eyes couldn't follow. His hand closed around the enforcer's throat, and the sound of crushing cartilage filled the air like snapping twigs. The other 2 attacked simultaneously, and Kieran met them with fluid violence that was both beautiful and terrifying to witness. He fought like a force of nature, like something that had been perfecting the art of killing for longer than her country had existed. Bodies moved too fast to track, furniture exploded into splinters, and through it all, Kieran's eyes burned with silver fire that cast everything in stark relief. When the violence ended, 3 perfectly dressed corpses lay scattered across her apartment floor like broken dolls. Kieran stood in the center of the destruction, not even breathing hard, his clothes unmarked by the carnage. The silver light in his eyes faded slowly, leaving only winter storms and ancient sadness. "Now you know," he said quietly. "I am not the harmless stranger you rescued. I am a killer, Sarah Chen. I am the thing that other monsters fear in the dark. I am the vampire king, and through your kindness, you have become my queen." Sarah stared at the bodies, at the impossible destruction, at the man who had just revealed himself to be a creature from humanity's darkest myths. Her rational mind screamed denials, but the evidence lay scattered across her apartment in the form of 3 dead vampires who had moved like nightmares and died like men. The binding between them pulsed like a second heartbeat, and she understood with sudden clarity that there was no going back to her previous life. She was part of his world now, whether she wanted to be or not. 20 minutes later, as Kieran disposed of the bodies with efficient methodology that spoke of extensive practice, Sarah's phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. The message was formal, written in perfect English that somehow carried the cadence of much older speech. "Sarah Chen," the text read, "you are summoned to appear before the North American Vampire Council within 72 hours to validate your claim as Queen Consort to Kieran Blackwood, rightful king of the Northeastern Territories. Failure to appear will result in your immediate execution for violation of the secrecy laws. Your binding has been noted and recorded. Your fate is now tied to his. Choose wisely." The message was signed with a symbol that looked like a crown made of thorns, and beneath it, a single name that made Kieran go very still when she showed him the screen. Marcus Blackthorne, acting council leader in the absence of the rightful king. Sarah looked from the phone to Kieran, understanding finally dawning like a cold sunrise. She wasn't just bound to a vampire. She was bound to a king who had been overthrown, and the powers that had stolen his throne were now demanding she present herself for judgment. The game that had cost Kieran his memories was far from over, and she had just become its newest player. The watchers were gone from the street below, but Sarah knew with bone-deep certainty that they would be back. The council had issued its ultimatum, and she had 72 hours to decide whether to walk into what was almost certainly a trap, or spend the rest of her very short life running from creatures that could track her across continents. Kieran stood at her window, staring out at the city that spread below them like a glittering web, and Sarah realized that the bleeding stranger she had helped was about to drag her into a war that would determine the fate of both their species. Elena Vasquez arrived at Sarah's apartment like salvation wrapped in designer clothing and perfume that smelled of night-blooming jasmine. She moved with the fluid grace that Sarah was beginning to recognize as a vampire trait, but her approach felt different from the enforcers who had tried to kill them. Where they had radiated predatory menace, Elena projected warmth and concern, her dark eyes soft with what appeared to be genuine worry as she surveyed the lingering damage from the previous night's violence. She introduced herself as Kieran's former advisor, his closest friend, someone who had been searching frantically for him since his disappearance 3 weeks ago. Her relief at finding him safe seemed authentic, and when she embraced Kieran, Sarah saw him relax for the first time since the enforcer's attack. Elena explained the situation with the patience of someone accustomed to dealing with confused mortals who had stumbled into supernatural politics. Kieran was indeed a king, she confirmed, ruler of the North American Vampire Council's northeastern territories, a position he had held for over 2 centuries. The binding that Sarah had accidentally triggered was an ancient protection right that made her his queen consort in the eyes of vampire law, a bond so sacred that breaking it improperly could destroy them both. Elena's explanation felt like pieces of a puzzle clicking into place, answering questions that Sarah hadn't known how to ask. The Watchers, the Enforcers, the Council's ultimatum, all of it made sense in the context of vampire politics and the delicate balance of power that governed their hidden world. But Elena was careful with her truths, revealing just enough to seem helpful while concealing the deeper currents that had led to this moment. She spoke of Kieran's enemies within the council, rivals who had grown tired of his progressive policies regarding human-vampire relations, but she framed herself as his loyal supporter who had been working to protect his interests during his absence. What she didn't reveal was that she had orchestrated his downfall with surgical precision, using forbidden magic to sever his memories and leave him vulnerable to her manipulation. Elena offered to help break the binding safely, claiming that Sarah's normal life could still be preserved if they acted quickly enough. The ritual would be complex and dangerous, she explained, but her centuries of experience with vampire magic made her uniquely qualified to attempt it. She painted herself as Sarah's salvation, the only person who could free her from a supernatural entanglement that would otherwise consume her entirely. But even as she spoke the words of comfort and reassurance, Elena was studying Sarah with calculating eyes, measuring the depth of her linguistic abilities and the strength of her connection to Kieran. Each restored memory made him more dangerous to her carefully constructed coup, and Sarah's presence was accelerating his recovery beyond anything Elena had anticipated. The human woman wasn't just an accidental queen consort. She was an active threat to everything Elena had worked to achieve. Kieran listened to Elena's explanations with growing unease, fragments of memory stirring like sediment disturbed by deep currents. There was something wrong with her story, inconsistencies that his damaged mind couldn't quite grasp, but his instincts recognized as dangerous. When Elena mentioned the memory-severing attack that had left him confused and powerless, Kieran felt a flash of recognition that made his hands clench into fists. A ritual chamber, candles arranged in patterns that hurt to remember. Elena's voice speaking words that felt like chains wrapping around his mind. The memory was gone almost as quickly as it appeared, but it left behind a residue of suspicion that grew stronger with each passing moment. Sarah found herself caught between Elena's reasonable explanations and Kieran's increasingly agitated responses to his former advisor's presence. The binding between them pulsed with tension, and she could feel his growing distress through their connection like a discordant note in a symphony. When Elena suggested they travel to a secure location where the unbinding ritual could be performed safely, Kieran's rejection was immediate and violent. His eyes flashed silver, and he spoke in rapid bursts of his ancient tongue that Sarah caught fragments of. Betrayal, lies, danger. Elena responded with soothing words and gentle touches, but Sarah noticed how carefully she positioned herself between Kieran and the apartment door, how her sympathetic smile never quite reached her eyes. The confrontation came to a head when Elena grew impatient with Kieran's resistance and made the mistake of trying to compel him with vampire magic. Her voice took on harmonics that made the air itself seem thick and heavy, and she spoke a single word in the old tongue that should have forced obedience from any vampire under her influence. Instead, Kieran's response was explosive. Power erupted from him like a supernova, silver light blazing from his eyes as centuries of accumulated authority reasserted itself. Elena stumbled backward, genuine fear replacing her carefully maintained facade, and suddenly the truth stood naked between them, like a blade. She had been the one to attack him. She had severed his memories and left him to die, planning to return later and collect a broken puppet king she could manipulate from behind the throne. But Sarah's interference had accelerated his recovery beyond her ability to control, and now she was faced with a choice between retreat and open warfare against a vampire whose full power was rapidly returning. Elena's mask finally slipped completely as she realized that subtlety had failed, and desperate measures were her only remaining option. She spoke words of power that made reality itself seem to buckle and twist, summoning magic that Sarah's human senses could barely comprehend. The apartment filled with shadows that moved independently of any light source, and the temperature dropped so rapidly that frost began forming on the windows. Elena was no longer pretending to be Kieran's friend and ally. She was revealed as the architect of his downfall, a vampire ambitious enough to risk everything for a chance at ultimate power. But Kieran was no longer the confused stranger Sarah had found bleeding outside the subway. His memories were returning in cascades now, triggered by the direct threat to both himself and his bonded queen consort. He remembered Elena's betrayal in perfect detail, the way she had smiled while speaking the words that would steal his identity and leave him helpless. More importantly, he remembered why she had chosen that particular moment to strike. He had been preparing to abdicate voluntarily, to step down from the throne and transfer power to a democratically elected council that would work openly with human governments. His plan would have revolutionized vampire-human relations, bringing their species out of the shadows and into a new era of cooperation and mutual understanding. Elena and her conservative faction had seen this as an unacceptable threat to the traditional order that kept vampires as hidden predators ruling from darkness. Sarah watched in fascination and terror as the true scope of the conflict revealed itself. This wasn't just about vampire politics or personal ambition. Kieran's memory loss had been a preemptive strike in a war over the future of human-vampire relations, and her accidental involvement had tipped the balance of power in ways that neither side had anticipated. Elena's magic crashed against Kieran's defenses like waves against a cliff, but his power was growing stronger with each passing moment as more memories returned. Sarah realized that her linguistic abilities had been doing more than just helping him remember. They had been actively breaking the magical chains that Elena had wrapped around his mind. Every session, every translated phrase, every moment of connection between them had weakened the spell until it finally shattered completely under the pressure of direct confrontation. The battle between Elena and Kieran raged through Sarah's apartment with supernatural fury, but it was clear that Elena was fighting a losing battle. Her surprise attack had failed, and now she was facing a vampire king at full power whose protective instincts toward his queen consort made him exponentially more dangerous. When she realized that victory was impossible, Elena made one final desperate gambit. She spoke words that made the air itself scream, tearing a hole in reality that led somewhere else. Somewhere dark and cold that smelled of ancient stone and spilled blood. Before either Sarah or Kieran could stop her, she dove through the portal and vanished, but not before leaving behind a final message that chilled Sarah's blood. The council will never accept a human queen, Elena's disembodied voice echoed through the closing rift. They will hunt you both to the ends of the earth, rather than allow this precedent to stand. War is coming whether you choose it or not, and I will be ready for you when it arrives. The portal collapsed with a sound like breaking glass, leaving behind only the lingering scent of ozone and the terrible certainty that this was just the beginning of a conflict that would reshape both their worlds. Kieran stood in the aftermath of Elena's escape, his full memories restored and his power burning like silver fire in his eyes. He turned to Sarah with an expression that mixed regret and determination in equal measure. "I remember everything now," he said, his voice carrying the weight of centuries and the authority of absolute rule. Elena spoke the truth about one thing. War is indeed coming, and you are at the center of it, whether we wish it or not. The binding between us cannot be broken safely, and even if it could, you know too much about our world to simply return to your previous life. Sarah stared at this man who had revealed himself to be something far more complex and dangerous than she had ever imagined. He wasn't the monster she had feared, but neither was he the helpless stranger she had rescued. He was a king without a throne, a revolutionary whose vision of the future had nearly cost him everything, and now he was asking her to choose between the life she had always known and a destiny she never could have imagined. The apartment around them bore the scars of supernatural violence, but Sarah found herself thinking not of the destruction, but of the linguistic patterns she had been documenting, the impossible beauty of a language that predated human civilization. She was a scholar who had devoted her life to understanding dead tongues, and now she was being offered the chance to help write the future in a language that could reshape the relationship between species. The choice, when she finally made it, felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown darkness, but it also felt like the most natural thing in the world. She was Sarah Chen, student of dead languages, and accidentally crowned queen of creatures that ruled the night. And she was about to help a vampire king reclaim his throne and revolutionize the hidden world that existed in the shadows of her own. The council chamber existed in a place that shouldn't have been possible beneath Manhattan, carved from living rock in the abandoned subway tunnels that the city had forgotten decades ago. Sarah descended the iron stairs with Kieran at her side, each step echoing through passages that predated the modern transit system by centuries. The air grew colder as they descended, thick with the weight of accumulated power and ancient authority that made her bones ache in recognition of something far older than human civilization. Electric lights had been strung along the tunnel walls in a concession to modern convenience, but they flickered with unstable energy that cast everything in shifting shadows and reminded Sarah constantly that she was entering a world where different rules applied. The chamber itself was a circular amphitheater carved directly into the bedrock, its walls lined with stone benches that rose in tiers like a Roman Colosseum designed for creatures that had never needed sunlight to see. 12 figures sat in positions of honor on the elevated platform that dominated the far end of the space, their faces beautiful and terrible in the way that only immortals could manage. Each wore the formal robes of their station, deep burgundy fabric that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. And their collective gaze fell on Sarah with the weight of centuries of accumulated judgment. Marcus Blackthorne occupied the central throne, a position that should have belonged to Kieran but had been usurped during his absence. He was everything that Elena had been trying to appear, radiating authority and charismatic leadership that made it clear why the council had accepted his temporary rule. When he spoke, his voice carried the resonant harmonics that marked vampire nobility, and his words shaped themselves in the ancient tongue with the precision of someone who had been born to command. "Welcome, Sarah Chen," he said, and though he spoke in English, the formal cadence made her name sound like an indictment. "You stand before the assembled Council of the North American Territories to validate your claim as Queen Consort to Kieran Blackwood, whose throne remains empty, pending resolution of his unfortunate circumstances. The testing will commence immediately, and failure to prove your worthiness will result in the dissolution of your binding and your immediate execution for violation of the secrecy laws." Sarah felt the trap closing around her even as Marcus spoke the traditional words of greeting. This wasn't a validation ceremony. It was an execution disguised as ritual, orchestrated by Elena and her allies to eliminate both her and Kieran in a single stroke. The other council members watched with expressions that ranged from curious interest to open hostility, but she noticed that several seemed uncomfortable with the proceedings, their ancient faces marked by doubt that suggested not all of them were party to the conspiracy. Elena stood among the advisors at the platform's edge, her earlier mask of concerned friendship replaced by cold satisfaction as she watched her carefully laid plans unfold. She had positioned herself perfectly to benefit from the chaos that would follow Sarah's inevitable failure, ready to step forward as the voice of reason who could guide the council through the crisis that her own machinations had created. The testing chamber revealed itself to be far more than a simple meeting space, as hidden mechanisms activated throughout the carved stone walls. Symbols that had been invisible in the dim lighting began to glow with their own inner fire, and Sarah recognized them as the same linguistic patterns she had been documenting in Kieran's speech. This wasn't just a place where vampire law was administered. It was a ritual space where the very words of power that governed their society could be invoked with maximum effect. Marcus explained the trial with the detached professionalism of someone who had overseen countless executions disguised as legal proceedings. Sarah would be required to speak the complete binding oath in the original vampire tongue, a recitation that would take nearly an hour to complete and required perfect pronunciation of syllables that could permanently damage human vocal cords. During the recitation, the council members would be permitted to test her mental fortitude through psychic assault, probing her mind for weakness or deception that would prove her unworthy of the crown she claimed. Failure to complete the oath, mispronunciation of key phrases, or mental breakdown under psychic pressure would all be considered proof that the binding was illegitimate and must be dissolved immediately. What Marcus didn't explain, what Sarah only understood when the ritual actually began, was that each correctly spoken phrase of the oath would restore more of Kieran's memories and power, while simultaneously transforming her own physiology to better accommodate the supernatural bond between them. She wasn't just being tested for worthiness. She was being forced to choose between her humanity and her bond with a vampire king, with death waiting as the price of hesitation. The psychic assault began the moment she spoke the first words of the ancient oath, a coordinated attack from multiple council members that felt like ice picks being driven directly into her brain. They probed for weakness, for the inevitable human frailty that would prove her unfit to rule alongside immortals. But what they found instead was a mind trained by years of linguistic analysis and strengthened by genuine love for the man she was fighting to protect. Sarah had spent her academic career learning to hold complex grammatical structures in perfect mental organization, and that training served her well as vampire telepaths tried to shatter her concentration with waves of psychic interference. Each phrase of the oath came easier than the last, as her vocal cords adapted to sounds that human throats were never meant to produce, and she began to understand that the ritual was changing her in ways that went far beyond simple legal validation. Her vision sharpened until she could see individual dust motes floating in the chamber's stale air, her hearing amplified until she could distinguish the heartbeats of every vampire present, and most importantly, her connection to Kieran deepened until she could feel his memories returning like puzzle pieces clicking into place in her own mind. Through their bond, she witnessed Elena's betrayal from Kieran's perspective, saw the moment when his former advisor had smiled while speaking the words that would steal his identity and leave him helpless. But she also saw deeper truths that even Kieran hadn't fully understood at the time. Elena's coup wasn't just about personal ambition, it was part of a larger plan to prepare the vampire nation for open war against humanity. She had been systematically poisoning the council against humans for decades, presenting carefully selected evidence of human aggression while suppressing any information that suggested peaceful coexistence was possible. The progressive policies that Kieran had been implementing, his plans for voluntary abdication and democratic reform, had threatened to expose Elena's lies and render her war preparations meaningless. Sarah's recitation of the oath was revealing these hidden truths to everyone present, broadcasting Elena's deceptions through the psychic link that connected all council members during formal rituals. Some of the vampires who had been most vocal in their opposition to human-vampire cooperation were learning for the first time that their opinions had been shaped by decades of calculated manipulation. The chamber began to fracture along ideological lines as loyalists and rebels found themselves forced to choose sides in a conflict that could no longer be hidden behind polite political maneuvering. Marcus realized that the situation was spiraling beyond his control when several council members began demanding explanations for information they were receiving through the ritual link. Elena's careful web of lies was unraveling in real time as Sarah's transformation progressed, and the evidence of systematic deception was becoming impossible to deny. But instead of admitting defeat, Marcus doubled down on the conspiracy, using his authority as acting leader to declare the ritual contaminated and demand Sarah's immediate execution as a threat to vampire security. The order split the council completely, with nearly half refusing to comply and demanding a formal investigation into Elena's activities. Elena herself abandoned any pretense of innocence when she realized that her decades of careful planning were collapsing around her. She spoke words of power that made the chamber's ancient stones tremble, summoning magic that was forbidden even in times of war. Reality twisted around her as she attempted to tear open another portal, like the one she had used to escape Sarah's apartment, but this time Kieran was ready for her. His full power had returned during Sarah's recitation, and he met Elena's forbidden magic with authority that had been accumulating for over 2 centuries. The battle between them raged through the chamber with supernatural fury that left cracks in the bedrock walls and sent several council members fleeing for safer positions. Sarah continued her recitation through the chaos, each word now burning with silver fire as the ritual reached its climactic phase. She was no longer entirely human, but she wasn't quite vampire either. The transformation was creating something new, a bridge between species that represented the future that Kieran had been trying to build. The final words of the oath rang through the chamber with harmonics that made the air itself sing, and when the last syllable faded into silence, Sarah stood transformed. Elena's portal collapsed as her concentration was shattered by the completion of a ritual she had never intended to allow, trapping her in the chamber with the consequences of her actions finally catching up to her. Marcus found himself facing a council that was no longer united behind his leadership, with evidence of his complicity in Elena's deceptions now impossible to deny. The chamber fell silent except for the sound of settling stone and the rapid breathing of vampires who had just witnessed the birth of something unprecedented. Sarah Chen, graduate student in dead languages, had become the first human to successfully complete the Vampire Queen's oath, and in doing so had proven that the future Kieran envisioned wasn't just possible, but inevitable. The war that Elena had been preparing for would still come, but now it would be fought between those who clung to the old ways of secrecy and domination and those who chose to embrace a new era of cooperation and understanding between species that had been enemies far too long. The tunnels beneath New York City became a battlefield that night, ancient stone corridors echoing with the clash of supernatural forces as vampire fought, vampire in a civil war that would determine the future of both species. Elena had gathered her followers in the deepest parts of the abandoned subway system, claiming sections of tunnel that predated even the Vampire Council's original settlement beneath Manhattan. Her rebels moved through the darkness with predatory grace, vampires who believed that centuries of hiding in shadow were finally coming to an end, that the time had come to claim their rightful place as humanity's masters rather than its secret guardians. Kieran's loyalists held the main council chambers and the upper tunnel networks, but they were outnumbered by vampires who had grown tired of the old treaties and the careful balance that had kept their existence hidden from human authorities. The war wasn't just about political control. It was a fundamental clash between two visions of vampire-human relations, between those who saw humans as livestock to be managed and those who recognized them as equals deserving of respect and cooperation. Sarah found herself in the impossible position of being both the symbolic center of the conflict and one of its most valuable assets, her linguistic abilities making her uniquely qualified to decode the ancient law scrolls that might hold the key to ending the bloodshed. The Council's archives contained centuries of accumulated legal precedent, written in dialects of the old tongue that even most vampires could no longer read fluently. Working by candlelight in a secure chamber while the sounds of battle echoed through the stone corridors above, Sarah translated document after document, searching for some legal mechanism that could resolve the crisis without destroying everything that Kieran had worked to build. The breakthrough came when she discovered a scroll that described something called the Sovereign's Sacrifice, a ritual so ancient that most vampires had forgotten it ever existed. According to the text, a reigning monarch could choose to bind their entire nation to a specific set of laws or principles by offering their own life as the ultimate guarantee of compliance. The ritual would make it impossible for future rulers to violate the chosen principles without triggering magical consequences that would destroy the vampire nation itself. It was the ultimate expression of a leader's commitment to their people's future, but it required the willing death of someone who held absolute authority over the laws being enacted. Kieran's memories had been returning in fragments throughout the night as the stress of combat triggered deeper recollections of his long reign and the events that had led to Elena's betrayal. He remembered now why he had been preparing to abdicate when Elena struck, why he had been willing to give up centuries of accumulated power for a chance at something better. The vampire nation was dying slowly, poisoned by its own isolation and the growing paranoia that came from living forever in the shadows of a changing world. Technology was making secrecy increasingly difficult to maintain, and the younger generation of vampires was growing restless under laws that seemed designed to preserve the status quo rather than adapt to new realities. His plan had been radical in its simplicity. Rather than trying to maintain the old ways through increasingly desperate measures, he would surrender his crown and establish a new form of government that could work openly with human authorities. Democratic representation, constitutional limits on vampire power, formal treaties that acknowledged both species as equals in sharing the earth. Elena and her conservative faction had seen this as an unacceptable betrayal of everything their kind had fought to achieve. But Kieran had come to understand that evolution was the only alternative to extinction. The Sovereign's Sacrifice offered a way to make his vision permanent, to bind future vampire rulers to principles of peaceful coexistence that could never be undone by ambitious successors or changing political winds. But the ritual required his death, and the knowledge that this might be the only way to end the war filled him with a terrible sense of inevitability. Sarah found him standing in the archive chamber after she finished translating the scroll, his face marked by the kind of resigned determination that spoke of a man who had already made his choice. When she explained what the ritual could accomplish, he listened with the careful attention of someone who had been expecting exactly this revelation. It would work, he agreed, his voice carrying centuries of weariness beneath its calm surface. The magical binding would be absolute, making it impossible for Elena or anyone like her to drag the vampire nation into the kind of war that would expose their existence and invite mutual destruction. But Sarah had not rescued a dying stranger and fought her way through vampire politics just to watch the man she loved sacrifice himself for political necessity. The solution came to her as she studied Elena's original memory-severing spell, analyzing its structure with the same careful attention she had once devoted to dead languages and ancient grammatical systems. Magic, she was learning, followed rules as precise as any linguistic framework, and Elena's spell contained a fundamental flaw that could be exploited by someone who understood the underlying principles well enough. The memory-severing enchantment worked by creating artificial barriers in the target's mind, cutting off access to specific recollections while leaving the basic personality intact. But the barriers were maintained by the caster's ongoing will, and if that will could be broken or redirected, the spell would collapse back on itself with devastating effect. Sarah could use Elena's own magic against her, turning the vampire's greatest weapon into the instrument of her defeat. The counter-ritual was complex beyond anything Sarah had attempted, requiring her to speak words of power that had never been meant for human throats, while simultaneously maintaining perfect mental focus under conditions that would challenge even experienced vampire mages. The ancient syllables felt like molten metal in her mouth, and each phrase threatened to overwhelm her consciousness with raw magical energy that her transformed but still partly human mind struggled to process. Kieran begged her not to attempt something so dangerous, his growing memories of magical disasters making him understand exactly how much she was risking. The spell could easily destroy her sanity or kill her outright, and even success would leave her forever changed in ways that neither of them could predict. But Sarah had made her choice with the same determination that had led her to help a bleeding stranger outside a subway station. She was a scholar who had devoted her life to understanding impossible languages, and now she was being offered the chance to speak words that could reshape reality itself. The connection between them had deepened far beyond the original magical binding, evolving into something that felt like the other half of her soul finally falling into place. She loved him, not despite what he was, but because of it. Loved his dedication to peace, and his willingness to sacrifice everything for the future he envisioned. The ritual began in the depths of the tunnel system, as the battle raged above them, Sarah's voice rising in ancient cadences that made the stone walls themselves seem to respond. Elena felt the attack the moment it began, her own spells faltering as Sarah's counter-ritual started unraveling the magical structures that maintained her power. The vampire's response was swift and vicious, gathering her remaining forces for a desperate assault that would either break Sarah's concentration or kill everyone who threatened her dominion. The final confrontation erupted in Grand Central Terminal as Elena made her last gambit, using her remaining magical power to shatter the barriers that kept vampire law hidden from human observation. Hundreds of innocent people found themselves trapped in the main concourse as supernatural forces battled around them, their minds struggling to process impossible sights that violated everything they believed about the world. Elena's strategy was brutally simple. Force Kieran to choose between maintaining secrecy and protecting human lives, knowing that either choice would destroy everything he had worked to achieve. If he revealed vampire nature to save the civilians, he would trigger the very exposure that the old laws were designed to prevent. If he maintained the masquerade, hundreds of innocents would die, and their blood would be on his hands forever. Sarah's counter-ritual reached its climactic phase in that moment of impossible choice, her voice speaking words that burned like silver fire, as Elena's memory-severing spell turned back on its creator with compound interest. The vampire who had orchestrated so much suffering found herself trapped in the same mindless confusion she had inflicted on others, her centuries of accumulated knowledge and magical power dissolving like morning mist. But victory came at a price that Sarah had not anticipated. The magical backlash from successfully redirecting such a powerful spell left her temporarily voiceless, unable to speak the ancient words that maintained her supernatural bond with Kieran. Without the linguistic anchors that kept him connected to the human world, he began to fade like a photograph left too long in sunlight, his form becoming translucent as reality itself started to forget his existence. Elena was taken into council custody, her threat finally ended, but her defeat feeling hollow as Sarah watched the man she loved beginning to slip away into spaces between worlds that human eyes could never follow. The silence that followed Elena's defeat was more profound than any sound Sarah had ever experienced, a quietness that seemed to swallow not just noise, but possibility itself. Grand Central Terminal slowly returned to normal as council members worked to repair the shattered barriers between worlds, their ancient magic weaving new protections around human minds that had witnessed too much. The civilians who had been trapped in the supernatural crossfire found their memories gently edited, their recollections of impossible battles replaced with more mundane explanations for the chaos they had witnessed. But Sarah remained untouched by these merciful alterations, her transformed nature making her immune to the same spells that granted peaceful ignorance to others. She stood in the aftermath watching Kieran fade like watercolors bleeding into rain, his form becoming increasingly translucent as the magical anchors that kept him bound to physical reality dissolved one by one. Her voice was gone, not damaged, but fundamentally altered by the forces she had channeled during the counter-ritual, and without the ancient words that maintained their supernatural connection, he was slowly slipping into the spaces between worlds where vampires without earthly ties eventually disappeared forever. The loyal council members gathered around them in the restored chamber beneath the terminal, their faces marked by a mixture of triumph and sorrow that spoke to the bittersweet nature of their victory. Marcus Blackthorne, his temporary authority dissolved with Elena's defeat, approached with the careful respect due to a rightful queen whose sacrifice had saved them all from civil war. He explained the situation with the clinical precision of someone who had witnessed countless supernatural tragedies, his centuries of experience lending weight to words that carried the finality of absolute law. The magical transformation that Sarah had undergone during her counter-ritual had burned away the linguistic bridges that allowed human consciousness to maintain contact with vampire existence, leaving her caught between worlds in a way that could not be easily resolved. Kieran's connection to the human realm had always been tenuous, maintained primarily through the ancient oaths and blood bonds that tied him to his kingdom. But Sarah's presence had become the primary anchor that kept him from dissolving into the ethereal dimensions where displaced vampires eventually found their rest. Without her voice to speak the old words, without the magical harmonics that their bond required to remain stable, he was beginning the slow fade that would eventually leave him as nothing more than a memory preserved in council records. The options available to them were limited and carried consequences that would reshape their fundamental nature as individuals. Sarah could choose to complete her transformation into a full vampire, allowing the magical changes that had already begun in her physiology to reach their ultimate conclusion. The process would grant her immortality and the supernatural abilities necessary to maintain her bond with Kieran, but it would also strip away the last vestiges of her humanity and leave her forever changed into something that could never return to the academic life she had once cherished. Alternatively, Kieran could choose mortality, allowing his immortal nature to dissolve in favor of a purely human existence that would let him remain anchored to Sarah's world without requiring magical intervention. But this choice would cost him not only his vampiric powers, but also his accumulated centuries of memories, his connection to the kingdom he had ruled, and his ability to guide the vampire nation through the transformation he had envisioned. Either path would allow them to remain together, but both required sacrifices that touched the very core of their identities. The council granted them 24 hours to make their decision, a period that felt simultaneously endless and impossibly brief, as they wrestled with choices that would determine not only their personal future, but the fate of human-vampire relations for generations to come. Sarah spent those hours in the archive chamber where she had first discovered the sovereign's sacrifice ritual, surrounded by the law scrolls and ancient texts that had become her window into vampire civilization. Without her voice, she could not speak the words that would communicate her thoughts directly to Kieran, but their bond still allowed for deeper forms of connection that transcended language. Through touch and shared consciousness, they explored the implications of each choice, weighing personal desires against larger responsibilities. Kieran's restored memories included centuries of careful stewardship over the delicate balance between species, decades of work to establish the treaties and traditions that had prevented the kind of war Elena had tried to provoke. His knowledge and experience represented an irreplaceable resource for the vampire nation, particularly during the transitional period that would follow Elena's defeat and the establishment of new governmental structures. But he had also spent those same centuries yearning for the kind of genuine human connection that his immortal nature made almost impossible to achieve. Sarah represented not just love, but the possibility of understanding, the chance to bridge the gap between worlds that had defined his existence for longer than most human civilizations had survived. Sarah's own transformation during the recent crisis had shown her capabilities that extended far beyond academic scholarship, revealing an intuitive understanding of magical principles that could prove invaluable in the work of rebuilding vampire society. Her human perspective brought insights that pure vampire thinking could never achieve, and her linguistic abilities made her uniquely qualified to serve as a translator between species during the delicate negotiations that would be necessary to establish lasting peace. But accepting full vampiric transformation would mean abandoning the scholarly career that had given meaning to her previous life, leaving behind the human connections and academic pursuits that had shaped her identity since childhood. The choice became more complex as they considered the broader implications of their decision for the future of human-vampire relations. If Sarah became fully vampire, they would represent a powerful symbol of cooperation between species, their love story serving as evidence that the barriers between human and vampire were not insurmountable. But they would also lose the unique perspective that came from Sarah's human origins, potentially limiting their effectiveness as advocates for continued cooperation. If Kieran chose mortality, they would demonstrate that vampires could successfully integrate into human society, but his loss of immortal wisdom and supernatural abilities might weaken the vampire nation's ability to maintain the peace he had worked so hard to establish. The hours passed with agonizing slowness as they explored every angle of their situation, searching for alternatives that might preserve both their love and their individual natures. Sarah's voicelessness felt like a cruel irony, silencing the linguistic abilities that had brought them together at the moment when clear communication was most desperately needed. But their bond allowed for forms of understanding that went deeper than words, and gradually they began to perceive a third option that the council had not explicitly offered, but which their unique circumstances might make possible. As the deadline approached, Sarah and Kieran found themselves standing once again in the chamber where she had first completed the Vampire Queen's oath, surrounded by the stone walls that had witnessed so much transformation and sacrifice. The magical energies that suffused the space responded to their presence, ancient symbols beginning to glow with inner fire as the power that bound them together reached a critical threshold. Neither fully human nor completely vampire, Sarah existed in a liminal state that defied traditional categorization, while Kieran's own nature had been altered by their bond in ways that made him something more complex than a typical vampire king. The solution, when it finally revealed itself, felt both inevitable and impossible, a path that honored their love while preserving their essential natures and creating something entirely new in the process. But implementing it would require courage, trust, and a willingness to step into unknown territory where even the ancient laws provided no guidance for what they might become together. The answer came to Sarah in the deepest hour of night as she sat among the ancient texts, her fingers tracing symbols that seemed to pulse with their own inner light in response to her touch. The ritual she discovered was written in a dialect so archaic that even the oldest council members would have struggled to translate it. But her transformed linguistic abilities made the meaning clear as starlight on still water. It was called the convergence of spheres, a working so rare that it had been attempted perhaps 3 times in the entire history of vampire civilization, and never successfully by a human-vampire pairing. The text described a binding that would make them both something unprecedented, neither fully mortal nor completely immortal, but existing simultaneously in multiple planes of reality with the ability to bridge spaces that had always been separate. Sarah felt the rightness of it settle into her bones like recognition of a truth she had always known but never been able to articulate. This was what their bond had been evolving toward from the moment she first spoke words of protection over a bleeding stranger, what their love had been building through every crisis and transformation they had weathered together. Kieran sensed her discovery through their connection before she could even attempt to explain it, his fading form solidifying slightly as hope sparked between them like struck flint. The ritual was complex beyond anything either of them had previously attempted, requiring perfect synchronization between caster and subject, while channeling forces that could easily destroy them both if mishandled. But Sarah had spent weeks documenting the grammatical structures of reality-shaping magic, and Kieran's restored memories included centuries of experience with the most dangerous workings vampire civilization had ever developed. Together, they possessed the knowledge and power necessary to attempt something that would either save them both or destroy them in the effort. The convergence began at midnight in the chamber where Sarah had first spoken the Queen's oath, the stone walls responding to their combined will as ancient protections activated around them. Sarah spoke the opening syllables in a voice that had been transformed by magical fire into something that could shape the fundamental forces of existence, while Kieran channeled power that had been accumulating for over 2 centuries of rule. The ritual required them to voluntarily dissolve the boundaries between their individual consciousness, merging their minds and souls while maintaining just enough separation to preserve their unique perspectives and abilities. Sarah felt herself expanding beyond the confines of her physical form as the working progressed, her awareness stretching across dimensions she had never known existed. Her linguistic abilities evolved from mere translation into something approaching true magical speech, the power to communicate directly with the underlying structures of reality and convince them to reshape themselves according to her will. She could see the spaces between worlds where displaced vampires wandered in eternal twilight, could speak to the elemental forces that governed the transition between mortal and immortal states, could understand the deep grammar that connected all forms of supernatural existence. Kieran's transformation was equally profound, but moved in the opposite direction, his immortal nature gaining new depth and complexity as human emotion and perspective merged with centuries of accumulated power. He remained the vampire king, but with renewed connection to the humanity he had always sought to protect, his authority now flowing from understanding rather than mere dominance. The combination made him more effective as a leader and more capable of the kind of genuine empathy that would be essential in building lasting peace between species. When the ritual reached its climactic phase, Sarah felt her voice return, but changed into something that could speak across all planes of existence simultaneously. Her words carried harmonics that resonated in dimensions both physical and spiritual, and she used this new ability to anchor Kieran permanently to the human world while maintaining his connection to the vampire realm. He would never again fade into the spaces between worlds, but neither would he be limited by the traditional boundaries that separated mortal from immortal existence. The working concluded with both of them transformed into something unprecedented, beings who existed fully in multiple realities at once and could serve as bridges between worlds that had always been kept separate. The council members who witnessed the convergence recognized immediately that they were observing the birth of something that would reshape supernatural civilization, a new form of existence that offered possibilities no one had previously imagined. Sarah's first act with her evolved abilities was to establish formal diplomatic relations between human and vampire governments, using her unique nature to serve as a translator and mediator in negotiations that would have been impossible under traditional circumstances. Her appointment as the first human ambassador to the Vampire Council created a new position that acknowledged the changing relationship between species while providing a framework for continued cooperation. Kieran's renewed humanity allowed him to resume his throne with a perspective that made him more effective as a reformer than he had ever been as a traditional ruler. The combination of immortal wisdom and mortal empathy gave him insights that proved invaluable in drafting new laws and treaties that could accommodate both human and vampire needs without compromising the essential nature of either species. Working together, they began the complex process of rewriting vampire law to reflect the new realities of their shared world. The ancient codes that had governed supernatural civilization for millennia were carefully examined and modified to support peaceful coexistence rather than enforced separation. Treaties were drafted that would allow limited cooperation between human and vampire authorities in matters of mutual concern, while still maintaining the secrecy necessary to prevent panic and persecution. The process was painstakingly slow and required delicate negotiation with conservative factions on both sides who viewed any change as unacceptable compromise. But Sarah's diplomatic abilities and Kieran's renewed authority made progress possible in ways that would have been impossible under previous circumstances. They established new council procedures that included human input on policies affecting both species, created educational programs to help younger vampires understand and respect human culture, and developed emergency protocols for situations where supernatural activities might impact human populations. Their personal relationship became a symbol of the cooperation they were working to establish, proof that the barriers between human and vampire were not insurmountable when approached with genuine understanding and mutual respect. But their success also attracted attention from powers that preferred the old ways of separation and conflict, entities far older than the Vampire Council who viewed their unprecedented bond as a dangerous precedent that threatened the established order of supernatural civilization. As Sarah and Kieran worked late into the night in their shared study, surrounded by law scrolls and diplomatic documents that would reshape two worlds, shadows moved outside their windows with purposes that went far beyond simple observation. Ancient beings who had remained hidden while vampires and humans developed their civilizations in careful isolation, now stirred with concern about changes that might force them to reveal themselves or abandon territories they had claimed long before either species learned to build cities. The first human-vampire accord took shape under their combined efforts, a document that would serve as the foundation for a new era of cooperation and understanding. Sarah's linguistic expertise ensured that every clause was precisely crafted to prevent misinterpretation, while Kieran's legal knowledge guaranteed that the agreement would stand up to challenges from both human courts and vampire law. Their hands moved together as they wrote, fingers intertwined in a gesture that spoke to their personal bond, while their minds worked in harmony to solve problems that had seemed insurmountable just weeks before. But even as they celebrated the completion of their revolutionary treaty, both of them were aware that their work had attracted the attention of entities whose opposition would make Elena's rebellion seem like a minor disagreement between neighbors. The shadows outside their window shifted with intelligences that predated written history, and in the distance, older powers began to wake from slumbers that had lasted since the dawn of human civilization. The future they were building together would not be achieved without challenges that would test their bond and their abilities in ways they could not yet imagine. But for this moment, they were content to exist in the space they had carved out between worlds, writing the first chapter of a story that would echo through both species for generations to come. Sarah looked up from the document they were crafting to meet Kieran's eyes, seeing in them the reflection of possibilities that stretched far beyond their immediate circumstances, and spoke the first words of the new language they were creating together, syllables that carried the weight of two worlds learning to trust each other at last.